Hi, and welcome to the video edition of South by Texas State. We're here today at Austin's Dog and Duck Bar to film the South by Southwest panel, Is Aristotle on Twitter? Aristotle on Twitter. This is an eye-catching title that is without a doubt intriguing, but some may find confusing at first glance.
Jim actually came up with the title, I think, as we were all sort of brainstorming. We bumped into each other last year at South by Southwest, Jim and John and I, and we started thinking about rhetoric. We're all involved in rhetoric, and we're all increasingly interested in technology. And so we started playing with different ways of putting the two together, rhetoric and technology. And so we came up with this question, is Aristotle on Twitter? The idea being, is there room for classical rhetorical theory and new technology?
And the gist of it being that, you know, even though the accepted model that we got from the classical scholars doesn't necessarily fit, there's other ideas in the history of rhetoric that we can use to apply to those particular texts to help us have a sort of a guide for how we can put text together in a way that's beneficial to an audience.
It's also worth noting that Aristotle actually is on
Yes,
Twitter. There's an Aristotle account on Twitter. I think Will is currently following Aristotle.
I think he has 5 followers.
And the big Aristotle is also on Twitter. Shaquille O'Neal, who has dubbed himself the big Aristotle, and is one of the most popular Twitterers. So another thing we're interested in is how someone like Shaq becomes the rhetor for the 21st century, and how he grabs everyone's attention. I mean, man has thousands and thousands of people following him. So,
For those of you watching at home who are not rhetoricians or social media mavens, how does this panel actually weave these two topics together in one discussion?
From its very beginning, at least what we know as the beginning, technology was a major issue, because in these little city-states where people are trying to have decisions made by 501, 601, 1,001 people, or even the assemblies, which were bigger, the lack of technology limited how big a city-state could be and how much people could talk, because it was a question of how much you could make yourself heard.
It got to a point in the 20th century, probably like the middle of the 20th century, right, the 60s, where a lot of the faculty that got, I don't want to say stuck, but were required to teach those courses realized that the tools that were available to them were a little bit lacking, and they turned back to classical rhetoric. And a lot of them, not necessarily turned back, but took on those tools that other people would always use, say in philosophy departments or communication and speech departments, and started applying them to the problems of teaching writing, especially in the college setting.
My research interest is 19th century literature, which combines the sort of great age of the novel with the rise of national culture. And so my interest in digital literacies is actually how currently those sort of material culture modes of thinking or modes of preserving culture are changing. So I'm really interested in the digital archive and how that makes us rethink national culture and how we preserve it and how we communicate it. The 19th century is all about the stuff, and our digital future threatens to be sort of immaterial and indiscriminate, and there's a lot of anxieties surrounding that sort of loss of the stuff.
Every time the technology changes, it has some kind of significant change for how we think about argumentation, how we think about talking with each other. So yeah, if you're in rhetoric, you can't help but think about technology.
I think one of the main things that we're seeing right now is that our institutions are not sacred. If they don't adapt, they will disappear or become irrelevant. I think we're seeing this right now with newspapers. We're seeing this in the music industry. We're seeing this in the film industry. And I think we have to ask ourselves in academia the same questions. And we have to learn actually from some of their mistakes and from some of their successes in other industries. Why are we still relevant? And I think that's one of the questions that generated this panel.
This panel will discuss, among other things, the important contributions of Aristotle and Cicero to the field of communications. For those of you who are not entirely familiar with their communication principles, how do they influence modern communication as we know it today?
Aristotle is the first extant text we have. He didn't write the first rhetoric book. There were other ones that did. And what he meant by rhetoric was really all-inclusive. It was just speech, just how people talked with one another. And so what he was trying to do was to describe it, and that means that in a way he may not have influenced things as much as if he was right, then the basic principles should still apply, and they really do. Cicero in a way was a little bit more influential because Cicero he wrote a book, De Oratore, and another one, De Inventione, that everybody read through the 19th century. That was what you did in your class, and everybody liked to cite Cicero, and that's how you showed that you had a kind of certain amount of cultural capital, was that you could cite your Cicero. And some of the things that they suggested, people got very rigid about. Like, I keep going back to John's mention of the 6 parts of the classical oration that people kept using even when it was no longer necessary, it was no longer appropriate, it was no longer even relevant. But that's just what you did, and so people had to do that. But what I see as particularly important for technology now is that Aristotle's big point was that what you do needs to be appropriate to your audience. And it needs to be appropriate to the context. And that's what good rhetoric does under just about any circumstance. He also made a big point that he saw rhetoric as not just a way you get someone to do what you want, but actually how communities make good decisions together. And that's opened up again in really interesting ways with the internet and the possibility of people who wouldn't necessarily write a letter to the editor or engage in the very limited forms of public deliberation we had for a while. They can put up a blog, they can comment on a web page, they can do a Twitter. So it's in a certain way back to a little bit closer to what Aristotle saw. So
I find this to be interesting in terms of how people learn to deliver discourse and to deliver speeches or even to act. And so one of the things I'll talk about in this presentation is YouTube and how YouTube is how we learn to deliver things now. So one of the interesting things that's happening, and I think Will touched on this earlier, is that whereas the rhetoric instructor or the teacher in general used to be the place where we learn to deliver or to give speeches or to write, we learn in these other spaces now. We still can act on these principles that we have, but the principles aren't necessarily taught by the teacher. They're taught in a bunch of different spaces, and I think these are the spaces that a lot of us are actually interested in.
So how does a group like this come together to talk about rhetoric and technology?
In a lot of ways, the same way like a Wikipedia article might be written, where like I'm not an expert, I'm just a dude who like had an idea and who slapped it up there, and it sort of gathered momentum in a really organic way, and as it did, it became way bigger and better than I could have ever done on my own, or even really could have imagined. So it's really great, and I think it's a way that new technologies are sort of like migrating to our off-screen lives as well.
But we all, I think, come at things from a different kind of angle. So I think we have an interesting cross-section or sort of kaleidoscope of approaches to these questions.
Probably my favorite comment that we got on the South by Southwest panel picker was that this looks really interesting. South by Southwest needs a bit of theory. And I think that that's something that we all are thinking about as public intellectuals, is that theory is not something that should be reserved for the academy, but something that we should share with the public and hear from the public, because it's not that people aren't thinking critically about technology, it's that, they need to be given sort of format to be thinking about this.
We wanted to make sure it wasn't a bunch of people listening in on a bunch of nerds talking about rhetoric. And we wanted it to really make sense to someone who had never heard of the term, the canons of rhetoric. The ideas make sense once you hear what they are. They're very, I think it is an intuitive thing. Delivery, memory, these things make sense, but we wanted to make it relevant to people who would be at South by Southwest.
Well, I think these things are intuitive, not because they're sort of like inborn qualities, like where we all know how to communicate, right? They're intuitive because they've been around for 2,000 years or more, right? Like, these are ideas that that every layer of communication technology has built upon.
We don't have to talk very abstractly about how every text is a collaboration, because it takes from sources all over the place. Because we have an example like Wikipedia, where we can concretely show, here's all the different ways that information can be taken from different places and combined into a new whole. But I think that's really fascinating.
Well, there you have it, everyone. You can catch this panel on Tuesday, March 17th at 10 a.m. in Room B. For South by Texas State, I'm Adam Lee reporting.